When we imagine ancient Rome, we think of emperors and armies, marble temples and bloody arenas. But beneath the grandeur, in the shadows of markets, behind taverns and down quiet alleys, another world was thriving, a world of whispered names, of perfume and politics, of women whose stories were never carved into stone, but who knew everything about survival. They weren't honored, they weren't safe, but they were essential. This is the untold rhythm of their days, the ones history chose not to remember. Let's step into the daily life of a Roman prostitute and see what truly happened hour by hour behind the veil of empire. The streets of Rome wake slowly with a soft rustling of sandals over worn cobblestones and the distant clatter of carts being pulled through the early morning fog. The city is never truly quiet, but there is a hush before the sun rises above the tiled roofs. In a cramped upper room of an insula Roman apartment block, a woman stirs. Her name is Livia, not her birth name, but the one she chose when she began this life. Her room is sparse: a straw mattress, a chipped oil lamp, a small wooden comb, and a bronze mirror dulled with age. The scent of yesterday's smoke still clings to the fabric of her tunic. She washes her face with cool water from a ceramic jug, wincing as she presses a cloth against the bruise near her collarbone. There is no time for tenderness. The day has begun. She dresses quietly, listening to the hum of the waking city through the open window. Voices float up from the street vendors, preparing their carts, bakers tending fires, an old man singing to himself as he sweeps the alley. Rome is stirring, and so must she. Her sandals are worn. The leather straps have been tied and retied, but they still carry her forward. Livia is a registered Meretrician official, taxed prostitute. She holds a state-issued license, though it offers little protection. Her name is on a list kept by aediles, the Roman magistrates who oversee such things. At least, she thinks it still is. She gathers her small things into a clothed pouch choils, a comb, a sliver of soap, and the few coins she didn't hide the night before. Then she leaves. The stairs creak beneath her feet. Outside, the morning air is cool and carries the scent of bread, fish, and horses. She wraps a shawl over her shoulders and blends into the crowd. The first stop is the public latrine. It's not glamorous, but it's where many start their day. She nods to the old attendant, pays a small coin, and waits her turn. The tiles are damp. Afterward, she visits the fountain. There, she sits for a moment, letting the water run over her hands, watching a pigeon bathe beside her. She takes the long way through the marketplace. It's still early, and the crowds haven't thickened. She passes a stall of dyed wool, another with jars of honey, and one selling cheap perfumes. She lingers there, running her fingers over a clay bottle labeled lilac. The scent reminds her of someone from another life. Some mornings, she walks to the suburban's crowded, lower-class district where clients are more common, though less generous. The streets there are loud, full of noise and elbows, but she knows how to navigate them. She nods to other women she passes, some older, some just beginning. There's a silent understanding among them. They are not friends, but they are not alone either. At a small fountain, she stops again to rinse her hands. A boy nearby offers her a fig for a coin. She declines with a tired smile. He reminds her of her brother. She hasn't seen him in years. She wonders where he is now, if he'd recognize her. She spends part of the morning near the baths. The scent of oils and steam rises from the open-air caldariums. She doesn't go in, those fees are for clients, but she watches the foot traffic. Men with loose tunics and wet hair, laughing, bargaining, brushing past her without a glance. Sometimes one stops. She makes her way to the brothel near the foot of the Aventine Hill. Its walls are adorned with faded paintings, once erotic, now simply tired. There are small rooms, each with a stone bed and a thin mat. Clients come and go, most without names, some with too many. They pay a few coins, sometimes less, and leave quickly. The work is mechanical. There is little conversation, only gestures and hurried movements. She does what she must and retreats when she can. In the moments between, she tries to rest. She drinks watered wine. She adjusts her clothing. She breathes. Sometimes she hums softly to herself. A lullaby her mother used to sing. It's the only sound in her room when the door is closed. The brothel never truly sleeps, but there are brief, silent pauses between the knock of sandals and the next request. Livia's work is not about desire. It is about survival. Her face, once full of youth, now carries shadows of sleepless nights and forced smiles. But she knows how to read a man, how to soften her voice, how to appear untouched by the weariness of repetition. These are skills honed like any trade. In the afternoon, she eats a piece of bread with olives, sitting in the shade behind the brothel. She listens to merchants shouting about figs and fish, two children laughing as they chase each other between stalls. For a moment, she pretends she is one of them, a woman with a basket, a destination, a name that wasn't chosen for a ledger. Later, she helps another girl bind a cut on her hand. They don't speak much, but there's comfort in the silence. They share a bit of honeyed wine and rest their backs against the same wall. In this world, small kindnesses matter. Sometimes she writes words in the dirt with a stick, a memory, a thought, a name, then wipes them away before anyone can see. The better paying clients arrive later. wealthier men, soldiers, travelers, men with wives who look away. They prefer discretion, and Livia knows how to provide it. For them, she becomes someone else entirely softer, slower, more mysterious. She lights incense and pretends the room smells of myrrh instead of mildew. She listens more than she speaks. Some men confess things, others weep. Some say nothing at all. They leave behind money and sometimes secrets. She keeps both hidden. Her face reveals nothing. Her silence is part of the service. One client, a senator's aide, brings her a small bronze pendant once. He doesn't say why. She accepts it with a nod, places it in a pouch, and never wears it. Another brings wine, too much wine. She drinks just enough to keep the mood light. As evening falls, the streets grow louder. Music from lyres drifts from nearby courtyards. Torches flicker to life. The city begins its second shift, full of wine, shadows, and whispered names. Livia returns to her room, tired but alert. She counts her coins. She hides them beneath a loose tile. She checks the lock on her door twice, then 3 times. She combs her hair before bed, a small act of control in a world where she owns almost nothing. She stares into the bronze mirror. She does not smile, but she does not cry either. She lights a small lamp and watches the flame flicker. It's the only light she allows before sleep. She lies down carefully, avoiding the sore spots. Her hands are dry. Her shoulders ache. She closes her eyes. Outside, Rome breathes. A cart rumbles past. A man laughs somewhere in the distance. The moon rises over a city of 1,000,000 stories, and Livia sleeps without dreams. Tomorrow will come against low and familiar, and she will rise with it. In the Roman Empire, identity was everything. To be known was to be categorized, defined, and placed into a structure. And in that grand mosaic of names, roles, and ranks, prostitutes had their own uncertain corner, neither sacred nor entirely profane. Not outlawed, but far from honored. Prostitution was legal in Rome. This surprises many modern minds raised on systems where legality often implies approval or protection. But in Rome, legality did not mean safety. It did not mean kindness. It meant recognition and revenue. A woman who chose or was forced to sell her body for money could register with the authorities and become a meretrix, a taxed and acknowledged practitioner of the sex trade. Her name was added to a registry held by the aediles. The civic officials responsible for overseeing markets, games, public hygiene, and prostitution. These magistrates wielded immense power, but their duties were often administrative. A prostitute was a line item, not a life. The term, end quote, meretrix, end quote, itself comes from the Latin, end quote, meaner, end quote, meaning, end quote, to earn, end quote. These were earners workers whose trade was acknowledged but morally sidelined. Rome saw sex work as a fact of life, necessary for the moral balance of society. Philosophers like Seneca and Cicero wrote about prostitutes without sanctimony, acknowledging them as part of urban life, albeit from a distance. But meretrix was just one term. Rome had many. The, end quote, lupi, end quote, or she-wolves were the most vulnerable. They operated without licenses, worked in alleyways, and were often slaves. Their name carried more than just menacet, echoed the ancient myth of Romulus and Remus, suckled by a lupa, which to Romans signified both a literal wolf and a prostitute. There were also the scorta, a general term for harlots, often shouted with contempt. Fameuses were notorious women, known by reputation. Delicates were refined, the elite among courtesans. Some even carried the title amica, meaning girlfriend. For those who maintained long-standing arrangements with patrons, Rome had a name for every shade of sexuality. Language was classification and control. Clothing, too, was codified. Respectable Roman women wore the stola, often accompanied by a palla, signaling modesty and family honor. Prostitutes were often required to wear the toga, a garment usually worn by male citizens. To wear the toga was to visually announce one's exclusion from feminine virtue. It was a legal and social inversion. The public could spot them by dress alone, and that was the point. Prostitutes were officially classed as, end quote, infames, end quote. Along with gladiators, actors, and criminals, they were stripped of legal credibility. They could not testify in court, hold public office, or marry men of rank. Their words held no legal weight. Their stories were not to be believed. Yet, the state collected taxes from them, enforced regulations, and relied on the economic boost they brought to districts like the Suburra. Brothels came in many forms. Some were state-run and rented to managers. Others were private, tucked behind inns or bathhouses. They varied in quality from dingy one-room stalls to elegant upper-floor salons, but most were narrow, cramped, poorly ventilated spaces. Beds were slabs of stone with straw. Privacy was rare. The most infamous brothels were in Pompeii. There, the walls still carry erotic frescoes and graffiti etched by clients and workers. Some inscriptions are humorous, others are cruel. Some simply record names and acts. It was a space that offered momentary escape but little dignity. Within this world, there were ranks. The, end quote, diobolars, end quote, charged to oboza trivial sum. The, end quote, quadrantaria, end quote, charged even less. At the top were the delicate women whose beauty, education, and performance elevated them above the street. These women could command not only gold, but poetry, influence, and sometimes affection. Delicata were a contradiction. Their presence was both desired and feared. They were invited to private banquets, but excluded from the family line. They knew literature, philosophy, and wine etiquette. They were trained in music and storytelling. But their power was always conditional, tied to the favor of men. And when that favor was withdrawn, their decline could be swift. A dismissed courtesan might fall back into common brothels, or worse, be discarded into the streets. There was no pension for beauty, no safety net for those whose fortunes depended on the affections of others. Some sex workers operated out of taverns. Others used street corners, bathhouse entrances, or rented single rooms for an hour at a time. The variety was endless. The risks constant. Beatings were common. Legal recourse was almost non-existent. For enslaved women, there was no choice. They could be trained as sex slaves, sometimes from adolescence. Their contracts, known as, end quote, lex mancipi, end quote, were signed by their owners. Some were branded. Many were resold multiple times. Their lives were dictated entirely by market demand and their masters' whims. Yet, even in these harsh conditions, some carved out slivers of independence. They saved coins in secret, bartered for better conditions, and occasionally purchased their freedom. Those who did might register as meretresses, choosing legal work over slavery. But freedom was rarely full. Temples, paradoxically, sometimes stood near these brothels. The goddess, Venus protector of love and beauty, was often invoked by sex workers. Her statues bore wreaths, perfumes, and small offerings. It was said that some prayed to her for protection, others for mercy. During the Floralia, prostitutes took center stage, celebrated in wild revelry. For a few days, they were queens of the city. Afterward, the masks came off. Male prostitutes, too, existed. They served both men and women, often freedmen, occasionally slaves. They too wore the toga of infamia. Their presence was tolerated, though far less discussed in Roman law. They were shadows in a shadowed trade. The paradox of Roman prostitution lay in its structure. It was a system that regulated shame, created space for desire while pretending to elevate chastity. It punished women for selling what men routinely bought. It taxed and tolerated, but never truly accepted. In the eyes of Rome, these workers were necessary. They were the pressure valve for society's cravings. the unspoken balance to respectable households, but they were never honored. Their stories were whispered, erased, or twisted into moral fables. And yet, they were there, in every district, in every corner of Roman life, in the shadows of temples, in the margins of poetry, in the memory of coins passed from palm to palm. And Rome, in all its grandeur, depended on their silence. To understand how the Romans viewed prostitution, one must first understand how they viewed the body knot as sacred, not as shameful, but as a tool, a vessel, a surface for transaction, a stage for myth, and at times an offering. The Roman world didn't divide the sacred from the sensual the way later societies might. Instead, it often wove them together. The gods themselves set the tone. Venus, the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, wasn't distant or abstract. She was real, invoked daily in prayers and rites. She represented desire, creation, and sometimes indulgence. Her temples dotted the Roman landscape, filled with perfumes, polished statues, and floral wreaths. Offerings to her ranged from coins and incense to symbols of affection and intimacy. And many of those offerings came from women who walked the city and number 39. S streets in silence, women whose profession was oldest, but whose names were rarely spoken. During festivals, boundaries softened. The Floralia, held in late April and dedicated to Flora, the goddess of flowers and fertility, was a riot of color and celebration. Prostitutes were not only allowed to take part, they were center stage. They danced, sang, and performed for cheering crowds. They shed the stigma, if only briefly, and became symbols of life's pleasures. Petals rained from balconies, flutes played into the evening, and the city allowed itself to laugh without consequence. In those moments, judgment was suspended. But rituals weren't always joyful. At certain crossroads, it was believed spirits lingered, lost, unnamed, or restless. Offerings were left there, often by prostitutes, in the hope of avoiding misfortune. Small cakes, bits of food, whispered prayers. These women lived close to the edge of society, and often closer to superstition. Amulets were worn for protection. Charms, both bought and homemade, were tucked into folds of clothing. Others tied red threads around their wrists to ward off the evil eye. The line between myth and medicine blurred as well. Certain perfumes and oils were thought to have mystical properties. Myrrh for allure, jasmine to awaken desire, rose to calm jealousy. In the cramped chambers of a lupanar, a single drop of scent could change the mood. These weren't just acts of vanity, they were rituals, quiet spells cast without a wand. Prostitutes weren't merely selling their bodies, they were offering a curated performance of emotion, intimacy, and illusion, each one steeped in its own kind of magic. And there was poetry. Roman poets wrote of love and lust, of courtesans and heartbreak. Catullus, Propertius, Martial, they all immortalized women whose names may have been stage names, whose affections may have been paid for, but whose presence lingered in ink centuries after their bodies were gone. Some poems were playful, others biting. Some praised a courtesan's beauty as divine. Others mocked her as cunning, manipulative, or past her prime. These poems were contradictory, both romantic and cruel. A courtesan could be compared to a goddess in one verse and condemned as filth in the next. She was muse and menace, sacred and soiled. She embodied Rome's deepest desires and its sharpest judgments. Beliefs around shame and honor wove tightly through this mythology. A man could visit a brothel and still be considered honorable, so long as he maintained his public dignity. But a woman, even if born free, could never reclaim her status once she crossed into that world. Her body became public property, and with that, her place in the social order was sealed. There were whispered legends, too, tales of women who had served the gods through their bodies, of priestesses whose rituals involved sacred intimacy. These stories lived on the margins, half dismissed. By the time of the empire, most temples rejected such practices, but the stories lingered, tucked into corners of memory. Some temples bore inscriptions suggesting that sex workers prayed for protection or gave thanks for fortune to Venus, who hears one stone reads, another for the gift of survival. The language is vague, but the sentiment is clear. For these women, the gods were not distant figures. They were essential allies in a world that offered little mercy. Even domestic rituals held meaning. Lighting a lamp at dusk, washing with cold water, whispering a name before sleep. These were acts that gave shape to days lived without structure. Rituals offered a sense of control in lives largely governed by others. In the brothels of Pompeii, mythology was literally painted on the walls. Frescoes depicted scenes of gods and mortals entwined, rising from the sea. Pan chasing a nymph, satyrs laughing in pursuit. These were not just decorations. They told stories. They justified desire. They reminded those within that pleasure was as old as the divine. And yet, mythology was also a mirror. It reflected back the contradictions of Roman life. A courtesan might be likened to Venus in poetry, but still denied entry into a proper household. Her presence might be blessed during a festival and cursed the day after. She lived inside the myth, but never truly escaped its consequences. Some believed that intercourse with a prostitute could cleanse the body before battle or before burial. It was a ritual of release. Others believed that a man could rid himself of bad luck through paid pleasure. These beliefs weren't written into law, but they circulated in stories, carried in conversation. The myths extended to the afterlife. There was fear among some that prostitutes would wander endlessly in the underworld unless properly mourned. Few had tombstones. Fewer had names etched in marble. Some clients, feeling guilt or affection, left behind tokens, a bracelet, a coin, a line of verse. And so myth became a survival mechanism. To compare oneself to Venus, even fleetingly, was to assert dignity in a society that offered little. Ritual became routine. A protective shell in a city of marble and judgment. Courtesans crafted their own myths. They created names, personas, reputations. They performed not only for clients, but for survival. In their mirrors, they saw not only their faces, but their roles, carefully chosen, strategically played. They practiced lines, gestures, expressions. They studied their clients like scholars. Each action, from the arrangement of hair to the lighting of a lamp, carried weight. Each gesture, each perfume, each word was part of a quiet, theater-repeated night after night. Some even kept small journal scraps of papyrus hidden in cloth bundles. Lists of clients, prayers, bits of poetry half remembered. The Romans believed in fate, but also in appearances. To control how one was seen was to claim a fragment of power. And in the stories they borrowed from the gods, prostitutes found a framework: flawed divinity, beautiful suffering, and the illusion of choice. In whispers behind curtains and in laughter on festival streets, their myths endured. Even their enemies repeated them, tales of seduction, betrayal, tragedy. These women became more than what they sold. They became cautionary tales, fantasies, archetypes, stories for others to project upon. From birth to death, from forum to brothel, myth shaped how people moved, how they judged, how they loved. And for sex workers, myth was both shelter and shackle. It offered a place, but rarely peace. They lit their lamps, rubbed oil on weary skin, whispered prayers in dark corners. They existed in a world where belief wrapped itself around every gesture. And in doing so, they became part of the myth themselves, forgotten by history, but never truly absent from the stories Rome told about itself. Not every Roman prostitute lived in a brothel. Some moved in circles of silk and poetry, away from stone beds and flickering oil lamps. These were the delicatessa, refined courtesans who dined with poets and slept in marble chambers. They wore perfume from Alexandria, bathed in imported oils, and understood how to walk into a room and hold it with a glance. Their profession required more than beauty. It required strategy, education, and above all, control. A delicata might have her own home, servants, and a steady patron. Some lived like nobility, with bronze mirrors, dyed garments, and access to private banquets. They were invited into villas, but rarely into family trees. Their survival depended on their wit, their memory, and their silence. She might keep a patron entertained with stories, music, or verses copied from Ovid. She'd know how to taste wine and when to laugh. She would have learned to navigate jealousy, both her own and others. And though she could influence, she could never belong. Her power was always borrowed. Some courtesans became lovers of generals. Some whispered into the ears of senators. There were rumors of women who had influenced policy, stopped marriages, and steered fortunes. But these stories, like the women themselves, were never fully confirmed. They lived in the space between admiration and suspicion. Their names were written in poems, but rarely in legal contracts. They might be remembered in graffiti or in the private letters of men, but they were rarely given titles that lasted. And if a patron lost interest or favor, they could fall as quickly as they rose. For every delicata, there were dozens more like Livia working in hidden doorways. Their rooms were shared. Their rooms were shared. Their time cheap. Their days repetitive. But they, too, developed strategies. They knew which streets were safer, which taverns offered warmth, which clients might speak gently, and which to avoid. Some women worked under madames, who offered a degree of protection in exchange for a share of earnings. Others worked independently, often vulnerable to abuse. Beatings were common. Arrests not unheard of. Though legal, prostitution was always at risk of public disgrace or unofficial punishment. Survival was the goal. Dignity was a luxury. Many women kept secret stashes of coins hidden beneath bricks or under straw mats. They stitched their savings into hems, buried them behind loose stones, or entrusted them to an older friend. A few dreamed of escape, a small shop, a different city, a life with their own name again. Some married clients, rarely those of high status, but enough to start anew. Others became midwives, bathhouse attendants, or laundresses. Some remained in the trade until age or illness pushed them aside. A few took jobs as housekeepers in inns or as attendants in temples, still navigating the edges of society. The lives of prostitutes rarely ended in tombs. Most left no graves, no statues, no inscriptions. And yet, their voices remain in graffiti, scratched into stone. In verses preserved on parchment, in the echoes of stories whispered from woman to woman. In Pompeii, the walls of the Lupanar still speak. Names like Meridema and Eleutherus are scratched above doorways. Crude jokes and tender farewells exist side by side. Felix loved. Here, Marcia was kind. I left my heart with Fortunata. These fragments are all that remain, but they are enough. Some clients returned, not just for sex, but for comfort. They came for conversation, for warmth, for the illusion that they were seen. These moments were not always exploitative. Some were real, others were pretend. And within those transactions, secrets were exchanged. Men confessed ambitions, regrets, and fears. Women listened, sometimes offering advice, sometimes just silence. In this, the prostitute became more than a body. She became a witness, a keeper of stories. There are tales mostly second-hand of women who blackmailed clients, who manipulated information, who traded secrets as currency. Whether these stories are true matters less than the fact they were told. The idea of the courtesan as a threat, a seductress with knowledge, became a myth in itself. High-ranking men feared scandal. A loose word in a marketplace, a rumor at a bathhouse, could ruin reputations. And so, power shifted quietly, sometimes with a glance, sometimes with a whispered name. In a society that prized discretion, women who knew how to remain silent or, when not too, held an invisible kind of power. The very act of surviving in this profession created a kind of strength, physical, emotional, psychological. Women learned to endure from rejection, illness, insult. They formed bonds with one another. Not always friendships, but alliances. Shared meals, shared warnings, shared laughter when possible. Some ran away from violent clients. Some defended each other when guards came with questions. Some took turns watching the door. These small gestures were part of a quiet resistance. Prostitutes also formed informal networks with tavern owners, bathhouse workers, and market women. Information was exchanged, favors bartered. These social webs helped them navigate danger. No one officially protected them, so they learned to protect themselves. Even at the highest levels, delicatessen were not safe. They could be cast out for aging, for pregnancy, for refusing a client. Beauty faded, and with it, value. The smarter ones prepared. They cultivated patrons who gave gifts of land, slaves, or jewelry. They learned to read and write, to keep ledgers, to negotiate. The cleverest learned to blend into Roman society without being noticed again. Some passed knowledge down. An older woman might take in a younger one, showing her how to read a man's mood, how to charge fairly, how to feign affection without surrendering the soul. In these teachings, there was mentorship, even a kind of love. These were unspoken traditions, handed down like recipes or spells. And there were children. Many prostitutes bore them. Some raised them. Others were forced to give them up or hide them. Some children never knew their mothers, and number 39. Names only that they came from the street, yet traces remain birth records in slave registries, names half remembered. Occasionally, a son or daughter rose in station, bearing no visible mark of their origin. Religion, too, played a part. Some women kept small shrines in their rooms, offerings to Venus, Fortuna, or Diana. Others sought forgiveness in temples, whispering prayers between appointments. Some lit lamps for lost friends. Others fasted during sacred days. One woman, it was said, lit a candle every night for the daughter she never saw again. And in rare cases, prostitutes became legends. A few were so famed that their names endured in satire and song. They were remembered for wit, for beauty, for daring, but most remained nameless part of the city's rhythm, never its record. Still, they shaped Rome, not through battles or buildings, but through quiet, daily resilience. They endured the noise, the cold, the stares, the silences. They adapted, survived, and kept living, even when the world pretended not to see them. They walked past temples and palaces. They watched children grow. They aged. They disappeared. But for a time, they held secrets. They held men's eyes. They held the weight of stories never written and truths never told. And that, too, is history.